Clara stared at the crisp $2 bill resting on the mahogany desk, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. $2. That was her entire inheritance. But as she tossed the worthless paper into her grandfather's battered leather trunk, the room's arrogant attorney suddenly gasped, his face draining of all color. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Caldwell, Sterling and Associates, a high-end law firm situated in the wealthiest district of Boston. Inside the climate-controlled, oak-paneled boardroom, Clara Hayes sat shivering in a damp trench coat that had lost its waterproofing 3 winters ago. She felt entirely out of place. Her worn-out boots left faint, embarrassing watermarks on the plush Persian rug, a stark contrast to the designer Italian leather shoes worn by her Aunt Beatrice and cousin Richard, who sat across the sprawling conference table. Clara was a 28-year-old single mother surviving on sheer willpower and double shifts at a diner in Southie. Her 7-year-old son, Leo, had severe asthma, and the mounting medical bills had pushed her to the brink of eviction. When the letter arrived demanding her presence at the reading of her estranged grandfather's will, a tiny, desperate spark of hope had ignited in her chest. Silas Montgomery had been an eccentric, reclusive man, alienated from most of his family due to his obsessive hoarding and paranoid tendencies. Yet, Clara was the only one who had ever bothered to visit him, bringing him groceries and enduring his cryptic rants about hidden legacies and the foolishness of modern banks. She hadn't expected millions. She just hoped for enough to fix her car's transmission and clear Leo's medical debt. At the head of the table sat Harrison Caldwell, a man whose tailored pinstripe suit and stern, bespectacled face radiated pragmatic authority. He cleared his throat, adjusting his gold-rimmed glasses before breaking the heavy silence. "We are gathered here to execute the final will and testament of Mr. Silas Montgomery," Caldwell began, his voice a practiced, emotionless drone. He shuffled a stack of thick parchment papers. "Mr. Montgomery's estate, while heavily disorganized, has been thoroughly audited by this firm. Aunt Beatrice, a woman whose face was pulled tight by expensive cosmetic procedures, leaned forward, her eyes glittering with undisguised greed. Beside her, Richard, who hadn't worked a day in his life thanks to a trust fund from his father's side, smirked while checking his luxury watch. "Let's skip the preamble, Harrison," Beatrice snapped, waving a manicured hand. "My father was a lunatic who lived in squalor, but we know he owned that prime real estate in Back Bay. Who gets the property?" Caldwell frowned at the interruption, but continued reading. "To my eldest daughter, Beatrice, I leave the Back Bay property, along with the portfolio of municipal bonds held at State Street Bank, on the condition she finally learns the value of $1, though I sincerely doubt she will." Beatrice's feigned look of offense was instantly replaced by a triumphant grin. "To my grandson, Richard," Caldwell continued, "I leave my collection of restored vintage Packard automobiles, currently housed in the upstate garage." Richard pumped a fist under the table. Clara's heart sank into her stomach. The real estate was worth millions. The vintage cars were worth hundreds of thousands. Her grandfather had always claimed he despised Beatrice and Richard for their superficiality, yet he was handing them a kingdom. Clara braced herself. What was left for her? The debts, the squalid, condemned Victorian house, filled to the brim with yellowing newspapers and junk? Caldwell flipped to the final page of the will. He paused, his eyebrows knitting together in faint confusion before he spoke. "And finally, to my granddaughter, Clara, the only one who showed me kindness without asking for a receipt, I leave my most prized possession." Clara sat up straighter. "A prized possession?" "I bequeath to Clara the iron-bound steamer trunk, located in my primary study, along with its entire contents, Caldwell read. He then gestured to a large, rusted, incredibly ugly wooden trunk sitting in the corner of the boardroom. It smelled faintly of mothballs, decaying paper, and damp earth. Beatrice let out a sharp, mocking laugh. A box of his trash. Oh, Clara, darling, how perfectly fitting for you. Richard snickered. Maybe there's a nice collection of used tin foil in there. You can recycle it for bus fare. Humiliation burned fiercely in Clara's cheeks, hot and sudden. She bit the inside of her cheek to keep from crying. She walked over to the trunk. Its leather straps were cracked, and the iron hinges were rusted shut. With a heavy sigh, she unlatched the front clasp. It opened with a loud, protesting groan. Clara peered inside. The trunk was mostly empty. At the bottom lay a few moth-eaten journals filled with Silas's illegible scrawl, a broken brass compass, and a single piece of heavy parchment. Pinned to the center of the parchment was a piece of currency. Clara reached down and unpinned it. It was a $2 bill. She stared at it. The green ink was slightly faded, Thomas Jefferson's face looking back at her, with what felt like a judgmental stare. $2, Clara whispered, her voice trembling. She turned the bill over, looking for a hidden check, a map, anything. But it was just a piece of paper money. After years of bringing him food, checking his vitals, and listening to his stories while her own life fell apart, Silas Montgomery had left her $2 and a box of literal garbage. The sheer absurdity of it struck her. It was a joke. A cruel, deliberate, final joke from a madman. Clara threw her head back and laughed. It wasn't a happy sound. It was a harsh, bitter laugh, born of pure exhaustion and despair. She casually tossed the $2 bill back into the open trunk. It fluttered down, landing on the dusty journals. "Well," Clara said, her voice dripping with sarcasm as she grabbed her damp coat. "Don't spend it all in one place, right? Thank you, Mr. Caldwell, for wasting my time." She turned toward the door, eager to escape the suffocating room and her family's gloating faces. "Ms. Hayes." "Wait." The voice didn't sound like the arrogant, polished attorney who had been speaking moments before. It was breathless, strained. Clara turned back. Harrison Caldwell had risen from his high-backed leather chair. He wasn't looking at Clara. He was staring directly into the trunk, his eyes wide, his jaw slightly slack. The color had completely drained from his face, leaving him a sickly, ashen gray. "Mr. Caldwell?" Beatrice asked, annoyed by the sudden shift in the room's atmosphere. "Is there a problem? Can we sign the transfer deeds now?" Caldwell ignored her. He walked slowly around the massive mahogany table, his eyes locked on the old piece of currency Clara had discarded. His hands, previously so steady as they held the legal documents, were visibly shaking. He reached into the trunk and gently, almost reverently, picked up the $2 bill. He didn't say a word. The silence in the room grew heavy, thick with sudden, unexplained tension. For a full minute, the only sound in the opulent boardroom was the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner and the relentless pounding of the Boston rain against the glass. Harrison Caldwell stood frozen, holding the $2 bill by its very edges, as if holding a fragile, priceless artifact. He reached into his breast pocket, pulled out a small jeweler's loupe, and pressed it to his right eye. He leaned toward the brass desk lamp, bathing the bill in harsh white light. "Harrison, for God's sake, what is it?" Richard demanded, his mocking tone faltering. "It's just a $2 bill. The old bat was probably senile when he pinned it there." "Be quiet," Caldwell snapped. The sheer authority in his voice made Richard flinch. Caldwell lowered the loupe, taking a deep, shuddering breath. He looked at Clara, his expression a mix of shock, awe, and an undeniable trace of fear. Ms. Hayes, the lawyer said softly, are you aware of the work of Q. David Bowers or the grading standards of the Professional Coin Grading Service? Clara blinked, utterly bewildered. No, I'm a waitress, Mr. Caldwell. I don't know anything about coins. This is not a standard modern $2 bill, Caldwell explained, his voice hushed. My father was a senior appraiser at Heritage Auctions in Dallas. I grew up surrounded by rare currency. What you have here, it shouldn't exist outside of a museum. Beatrice scoffed, crossing her arms. Oh, please, it has Thomas Jefferson on it. I see them at the bank all the time. Look closer, Beatrice, Caldwell said, holding the bill up, though he kept it safely out of her reach. That is not Thomas Jefferson, and this is not a Federal Reserve note. Clara took a step closer, squinting. Now that she looked carefully, the portrait wasn't Jefferson. It was a stern-looking man with a thick beard. This is an 1890 Treasury note, Caldwell said, his voice trembling again. It features General James McPherson. It is affectionately known among elite numismatists as the Grand Watermelon Bill, due to the intricate design of the zeros on the reverse side. Caldwell turned the bill over. The back was covered in ornate, swirling green engravings, with large, heavily patterned zeros that vaguely resembled watermelons. These were issued by the U.S. government for the purchase of silver bullion. They are exceptionally rare. A standard 1890 McPherson $2 note in this uncirculated, pristine condition could fetch upwards of $60,000 to $80,000 at auction. Clara's breath hitched. $80,000? It was enough. It was more than enough. It would clear her debts, pay for Leo's treatments, and give them a fresh start. Tears pricked her eyes. Her grandfather hadn't left her a joke. He had left her a lifeline. Well, Beatrice said, her voice suddenly tight, her eyes darting between the bill and Clara. Since it was found in the house that I inherited, surely that makes it part of the estate's general physical assets. Do not insult my intelligence, Beatrice, Caldwell interrupted sharply. The will explicitly states the trunk and its entire contents belong solely to Clara. This bill is hers. That's wonderful, Clara breathed, reaching out to take it. Mr. Caldwell, how do I sell it? Heritage Auctions, you said? But Caldwell didn't hand it over. Instead, he placed it gently back onto the desk. Ms. Hayes, $80,000 is a life-changing amount of money, but that is not why I went silent. He picked up the heavy parchment the bill had been pinned to. When I looked through my loop, I wasn't just looking at the engraving. I was looking at the serial number. And the seal. Caldwell pointed a manicured finger at a circular seal stamped on the front of the bill. Instead of the standard red or blue seal found on vintage currency, this one was a distinct, deep violet. The U.S. Treasury never issued a violet seal for the 1890 series, Caldwell explained. Never. And look at the serial number. Clara leaned in. The serial number read a -1934-NY-M SDC-0042. That's not a standard serial format, Clara noted, her confusion deepening. No, it's not, Caldwell agreed. It's a cipher and an instruction. Richard scoffed nervously. This is getting ridiculous. It's a fake bill, then, a counterfeit. It's printed on genuine 19th century Bureau of Engraving and Printing stock, Caldwell insisted. The microprinting, the rag paper blend. It's authentic U.S. Treasury material, but it was custom printed by someone with immense power and access. Caldwell walked back to the old trunk. He ran his hands along the rusted iron hinges, then down to the battered wooden floor of the chest. Your grandfather, Silas. Ms. Hayes, do you know what he did for a living before he became a recluse? "He told me he was an archivist," Clara replied. "He said he organized paperwork for a large firm in New York." "He was an archivist," Caldwell nodded slowly. "But not for a simple firm. Silas Montgomery was the chief private archivist for the board of directors at Chase Manhattan Bank during the 1970s. He handled documents dating back to the turn of the century, documents belonging to the wealthiest industrial families in American history." Caldwell pressed firmly on a dark, discolored knot in the wood at the bottom of the trunk. Click. Clara jumped as a hidden latch disengaged. Caldwell dug his fingernails into the seam of the wood and pulled upward. The entire bottom of the trunk lifted away, revealing a shallow, velvet-lined secret compartment. Beatrice gasped. Richard took a step back. Inside the hidden compartment lay 3 items. The first was a small, heavy, rectangular object wrapped in oiled leather. The second was a stack of yellowed, fragile ledger pages. The third was a solid brass key, heavy and ornate, with a sequence of numbers engraved on the bow, 0042. Caldwell picked up the brass key and placed it next to the $2 bill. He pointed to the serial number again, a -1934-NY-M SDC-0042. 1934, Caldwell deciphered aloud. NY-MSDC, New York Mercantile Safe Deposit Company. Clara stared at the key, the blood roaring in her ears. "The New York Mercantile Safe Deposit Company, isn't that—" "It is one of the oldest, most heavily fortified private vaults in Manhattan," Caldwell said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Founded by titans of industry to hide assets off the grid. And this key, paired with this custom-printed treasury note serving as a bearer bond." Caldwell looked up at Clara, his eyes wide. "Ms. Hayes, your grandfather didn't just leave you a rare coin collector's item. He left you the master key to Vault 42. And judging by the fact that he went through the trouble of hiding it in a false bottom, forging a U.S. Treasury cipher, and enduring a lifetime of paranoia," Caldwell swallowed hard. "I believe $80,000 is going to look like absolute pocket change." 72 hours later, Clara found herself stepping off the Acela Express train at Moynihan Train Hall in Manhattan, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was entirely out of her depth. Beside her walked Harrison Caldwell, who had officially stepped down as the executor of the Montgomery estate to become Clara's private legal counsel. It was a massive conflict of interest for his firm, but as Caldwell had bluntly told her on the train ride down, some secrets are worth tearing up a career for. They bypassed the towering glass skyscrapers of Midtown and headed deep into the financial district. The New York Mercantile Safe Deposit Company wasn't advertised on any billboard. It sat nestled between 2 monolithic banking headquarters on Wall Street, hiding behind an unassuming, unpolished granite facade. There were no windows, only a set of massive oxidized bronze doors guarded by 2 men in impeccably tailored charcoal suits. Caldwell presented a heavy black card to the guards. Without a word, one of them turned and inserted a physical key into the bronze door, pulling it open with a heavy pneumatic hiss. Clara stepped inside, shivering as the chilled, sterile air of the lobby washed over her. The interior was a cavernous space of black marble and brushed steel. A man with silver hair and a sharp, calculating gaze approached them. His name tag read, Gable. "Mr. Caldwell," Gable said, his voice a low, echoing rumble. "We do not often see you outside of Boston, and you have brought a guest." "This is Clara Hayes," Caldwell replied, his tone all business. "Granddaughter of Silas Montgomery. She is here to access his unit." Gable's eyes flicked to Clara, lingering for a fraction of a second on her worn sneakers and faded jeans before returning to Caldwell. "Mr. Montgomery's vault has not been accessed since October of 1987. We require the cipher, the bearer note, and the physical key." Clara reached into her handbag, her fingers trembling as she pulled out the sealed plastic sleeve Caldwell had provided for the 1890 Treasury note, along with the heavy brass key. Gable inspected the violet seal and the custom serial number under a handheld UV scanner. Satisfied, he gave a curt nod. "Follow me, Ms. Hayes. You as well, Mr. Caldwell." They descended 3 floors underground via a private elevator. When the doors parted, Clara gasped. They were standing in a subterranean fortress. The main vault door was a 3-foot-thick circle of solid titanium and steel gears already resting open. Beyond it lay endless rows of brushed steel lockboxes and larger, floor-to-ceiling private cages. Gable led them down a long, dimly lit corridor until they reached a secluded alcove. Embedded in the concrete wall was a large steel door bearing the engraved number 42. "The room is yours," Gable said, stepping back. "We do not monitor the interior of private vault rooms. Take as much time as you need." He turned and disappeared down the corridor. Clara looked at Caldwell, who offered an encouraging, albeit nervous, nod. She inserted the brass key into the heavy lock. It turned with a loud, satisfying click. She pulled the handle, and the heavy door swung open, revealing a small, windowless room illuminated by a single overhead fluorescent bulb. Sitting in the center of the room was a sleek, modern aluminum briefcase, a jarring contrast to the rusted wooden trunk Silas had left in his house. Beside the briefcase sat a thick, black, leather-bound ledger. Clara walked over to the steel table, her breath catching in her throat. She popped the latches on the briefcase. "Oh my God," she whispered. Caldwell stepped up beside her, letting out a sharp, stunned exhale. "I'll be damned. The old man actually did it." The briefcase was entirely filled with immaculate, vacuum-sealed stacks of bearer bonds. But these weren't ordinary corporate bonds. They were vintage U.S. Treasury bonds, each bearing a face value of $100,000, alongside stacks of pristine, authenticated certificates from the Union Bank of Switzerland. Tucked into the lid of the briefcase was a velvet pouch. Clara opened it, pouring its contents onto the table. A dozen loose diamonds cascaded out, catching the harsh fluorescent light and refracting it into blinding, icy blue sparks. "Argyle blue diamonds," Caldwell murmured, carefully picking one up. Certified by the Gemological Institute of America, judging by the microlaser inscriptions on the girdles. "Ms. Hayes, these gems alone are worth at least $10 million on the private market. The bearer bonds and the Swiss accounts. You are looking at liquid assets exceeding $50 million. Clara's knees buckled. She grabbed the edge of the steel table to steady herself. $50 million. The crushing weight of her reality, the past due notices, the threat of eviction, the agonizing nights listening to Leo wheeze in his sleep, unable to afford the best pulmonologists at Mass General Hospital, evaporated in a single, blinding instant. She began to cry, silent tears of overwhelming, absolute relief streaming down her face. But Caldwell wasn't looking at the money anymore. He had opened the black leather ledger. As his eyes scanned the handwritten pages, his expression darkened from awe to sheer, unadulterated horror. "Clara," Caldwell said, his voice deadly serious. "You need to look at this." Clara wiped her eyes and looked over his shoulder. The ledger was a meticulous, detailed record of illicit financial transactions dating back to the late 1970s. It detailed massive embezzlement schemes, offshore tax evasion, and political bribery orchestrated by the executives of Chase Manhattan and several elite Boston families. Silas didn't just archive their documents, Caldwell whispered. He copied them. He found out they were stealing millions, and he quietly siphoned off a fraction of their stolen wealth to build this untraceable nest egg. He held this ledger as his insurance policy. As long as he had this, they couldn't touch him. Caldwell turned to a page heavily bookmarked with a red ribbon. Clara's blood ran cold as she read the names on the page. Beatrice Montgomery, Back Bay Real Estate Acquisition, funded via Cayman Island Shell Corporation, illicit funds. Your grandfather didn't just leave you a fortune, Caldwell said, a grim smile playing on his lips. He left you a loaded gun, and he aimed it directly at your Aunt Beatrice. Rain had given way to a biting, bitter cold by the time Clara and Caldwell returned to Boston. They didn't go to Clara's cramped Southie apartment. Instead, Caldwell booked the penthouse suite at the Four Seasons, putting it on a black card he had quietly secured for Clara using the Swiss account credentials. While Clara arranged for private, around-the-clock nursing care for Leo and scheduled an immediate consultation with the chief of pediatric pulmonology, Caldwell went to war. Less than 48 hours after the vault opening, Beatrice and Richard initiated their attack. Outraged that Caldwell had resigned as the estate executor and vanished with Clara, Beatrice hired a ruthless litigation bulldog from a rival firm. They filed an emergency injunction, demanding the immediate surrender of the trunk, the $2 bill, and whatever assets Clara had uncovered, citing Silas Montgomery's diminished mental capacity at the time of the will's drafting. They demanded a meeting at Caldwell's former firm. Clara eagerly obliged. When Clara walked into the familiar, oak-paneled boardroom at Caldwell, Sterling and Associates, she was a completely different woman. Gone was the damp, pathetic trench coat. She wore a tailored slate-grey blazer, her posture straight, her chin held high. Caldwell flanked her, carrying a sleek leather portfolio. Beatrice sat at the table, sneering as they entered. Richard was busy scrolling on his phone, looking bored. Beatrice's new lawyer, a slick man named Sterling, the senior partner of the firm, stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. "Ms. Hayes, Harrison," Sterling said smoothly. "Let's be adults about this. My client is prepared to offer Clara a lump sum of $50,000 to walk away from the trunk and its downstream assets. It's a generous offer for a waitress. Take it, and we avoid dragging your grandfather's sad, senile legacy through probate court." Beatrice smiled thinly. "Take the money, Clara. Go pay your little boy's hospital bills. You don't belong in this world." Clara didn't sit down. She simply looked at her aunt, feeling absolutely nothing but cold pity. "Silas wasn't senile," Clara said, her voice steady and echoing clearly in the large room. "He was the smartest man I ever knew. He knew exactly what you were, Beatrice. He knew you were greedy, superficial, and completely ignorant of how the world actually works." Beatrice slammed her hand on the table. "How dare you speak to me?" "I'm speaking," Clara interrupted, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. The sheer authority in her voice made Beatrice snap her mouth shut. Caldwell opened his portfolio and slid a single, thick manila envelope across the table. It stopped perfectly in front of Sterling. "What is this?" Sterling asked, frowning. "That," Caldwell said, "is a certified copy of a financial ledger kept by Silas Montgomery. The original is currently sitting in a secure lockbox at the Federal Bureau of Investigation's White-Collar Crime Division in New York, with instructions to open it only if anything legally or physically untoward happens to Miss Hayes." Richard finally looked up from his phone, sensing the sudden shift in the room's atmosphere. Sterling opened the envelope and began reading the highlighted documents. As his eyes scanned the pages, the smug confidence melted from his face, replaced by a sickly, sweating panic. He looked at Beatrice, then back at the papers, his hands beginning to shake. "These are transaction records from the 1980s, Sterling stammered. "This implicates half the board of directors and it explicitly details the funding of the Back Bay estate," Clara finished for him. "The property Silas gifted to Beatrice in his will. The property you were so desperate to inherit." Clara leaned forward, resting her hands on the mahogany table. The money used to buy that estate and the municipal bonds at State Street was illegally funneled from a Cayman Island shell corporation tied to an insider trading syndicate. Silas kept the receipts, Beatrice's face drained of all its expensive cosmetic plumpness. She looked like a ghost. "No, that's a lie. He owned that house free and clear." "He owned the title, but the money is dirty," Caldwell explained with a predator's grin. "By accepting the Back Bay property and the bonds, you have legally accepted the liabilities attached to them. As of this morning, I have anonymously forwarded these specific pages to the IRS and the Securities and Exchange Commission. They are opening an investigation into the estate." "You tipped off the feds," Richard yelled, standing up. "Are you insane? You're ruining the family." "You ruined yourselves," Clara said coldly. "The federal government will be seizing the Back Bay property within the week under civil asset forfeiture laws. The municipal bonds will be frozen. You are going to spend the next decade drowning in legal fees just to keep yourselves out of federal prison." Beatrice began to hyperventilate, clutching her pearl necklace as she collapsed back into her chair. Sterling, her lawyer, was already packing his briefcase. "I cannot represent you in a federal RICO or money laundering investigation, Beatrice," Sterling said quickly, backing away from the table. "I have to excuse myself." "Wait! You can't just leave me!" Beatrice shrieked, but the boardroom door was already swinging shut behind him. Clara watched her aunt and cousin panic, feeling a profound sense of closure. Silas Montgomery had been a flawed, paranoid man, but he had orchestrated a brilliant, delayed justice. He had given his greedy daughter exactly what she asked for, the crown jewel of his estate, knowing it was a financial time bomb. And to the granddaughter who had brought him soup and listened to his stories, he had given the real empire. Clara turned to Caldwell and nodded. "We're done here." They walked out of the law firm, leaving the shouting and crying behind them. When they stepped out onto the Boston sidewalk, the rain had stopped, and the afternoon sun was breaking through the heavy clouds. "So," Caldwell said, adjusting his glasses. "Where to now, Miss Hayes? A private island? A new mansion?" Clara looked up at the clearing sky and smiled, thinking of her son. "Switzerland, Mr. Caldwell. I hear the alpine air is incredible for the lungs, and I have an appointment to make with the best doctors money can buy." She slipped her hands into the pockets of her expensive new coat and walked forward into the sunlight, leaving the shadows of her past permanently behind her. Did Clara's journey leave you speechless? This incredible story proves that the greatest treasures are often disguised as absolute trash, and that karma never misses its target. If you loved this twist-filled tale of hidden wealth and ultimate revenge, make sure to smash that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more amazing real-life dramas.